a meditative state, please listen to this week's Quality of the Week from Affirmations for Self-Healing. Generosity. Most people think of generosity as merely the giving of material benefits to others. More important, however, and much more satisfying, is a generous spirit, a willingness to let the other person shine, even if it means being eclipsed oneself. A happiness in his good fortune, even if it means personal loss for oneself. A concern for his safety, even if in an accident one's own property has been destroyed. Generosity, above all, recognizes that everything we have and are belongs to God alone and is his to dispose of where he will. Let's affirm together in a strong voice, I am happy in the good fortune of all.
I am happy in the good fortune of all.
Even more than in my own.
Even more than in my own.
For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom.
For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom.
In a normal tone, affirm, I am happy in the good fortune of all.
I am happy in the good fortune of all.
Even more than in my own.
Even more than in my own.
For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom.
For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom.
Going more inward in a whisper, affirm, I am happy in the good fortune of all. Even more than in my own. For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom. Drawing this affirmation into the subconscious, affirm silently, I am happy in the good fortune of all, even more than in my own. For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom. Drawing the energy up to the point between the eyebrows, superconsciously affirm silently, I am happy in the good fortune of all, even more than in my own. For in my happiness for them lies inner freedom. And the prayer, all that I have and am is thine, Divine Mother. Dispose of it as thou wilt.
We'll have our reading. Actually, before Jackie reads, did you check the Zoom speaker view and sound? Because maybe it's on Zoom. Did you check that on Zoom? Maybe something on Zoom isn't the speaker. Samsung. I think that's it, maybe. I'll try duty again after the time. Thank you, Jackie. Yes.
Week 33, the Satan exists.
Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. The Bible tells us in chapter 4 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Then, after baptism, was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. To most modern minds, this passage seems quaintly obsolete. Psychologists would say, have said, in fact, that the temptation of Jesus, if it occurred at all, was purely psychological. They call it a projection of desires lurking in his own subconscious mind. The subconscious plays a strong part, certainly, even if not a unique one, in any testing the spiritual seeker must undergo. The Bhagavad Gita, in dealing with this undeniable reality, quotes Arjuna in the 3rd chapter, and then Sri Krishna's reply. You tell me, teacher, said Arjuna, by what force doth man? Go to his ill, unwilling, as if one pushed him in that path? Krishna replied, Desire it is, passion it is, born of the darknesses, which pusheth him, mighty of appetite. Sinful and strong is this, man's enemy. Yet even Krishna describes passion as born of the darknesses. The fact is, as Paramhansa Yogananda wrote in Autobiography of a Yogi, all thoughts vibrate eternally in the cosmos. Thoughts are universally and not individually rooted. A truth cannot be created, but only perceived. Psychology, yes, but psychology attuned to currents of consciousness that pervade the entire universe, attracted by each of us according to our own personal inclinations. Yogananda, quoted in The Path, said, "I used to think Satan was only a human invention, but now I know and add my testimony to that of others who lived before me, that Satan is a reality. He is a universal conscious force whose sole aim is to keep all beings bound to the wheel of delusion. We should take pains, then, to attract uplifting currents of universal consciousness and to avoid attracting the negative which, disease that it is, can infect our thoughts even while it leads us to believe that our thoughts are purely our own. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind." Om, Om, Om.
Good morning, everyone. We'll start with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. And today I'll be reading number 186. Bless thy hummingbird to drink of thy honey. Miles and miles of eternity I traversed, humming thy name, seeking the garden of my dreams. I am thy tiny hummingbird, busily fluttering the wings of activity in service to thee. I must travel far to find thy rare orchid blossoms and to revel in the symphony of color on far mountain slopes of my dreams. I am thy busy hummingbird, ever humming thy name, dipping my long beak deep into the feeling heart of all soul qualities, golden, blue, marigold, and flowers of many hues. By thy grace, may I not inadvertently sip any bitter honey of evil. I am thy tiny hummingbird, buzzing with thy unceasing vitality, sipping from all the blossoms in thy fragrant garden of sweet joy and in the humblest wayside plots of all human sweetness. So may we not dip into the honey of evil, only the honey of good. And this topic today really speaks to the fact that to be embodied, we live through the rules of duality. And most foundational concept of duality is that of good and evil. And that's something that's embedded in us since we're children. And even in Genesis, we go from darkness to light. You know, God brought light into the darkness, and again, duality, light and darkness. And in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Eden is a place of perfect peace and harmony and bliss and love. And from that place, Adam and Eve were tempted and they fell again. And the temptation was desire. We know that the archangel Lucifer was one who was closest to God. And in fact, Lucifer means light bearer. So to think that one that was so close to God, because of desire, fell from God, fell into darkness. The story of Lucifer is that he took 1/3 of the angels in heaven in a revolt against God because of desire for power, and then he was expelled to hell and became known as Satan. So again, we're thinking of or talking of this theme of desire. And, you know, Satan isn't a personification of evil as a red being with horns and a pitchfork and a tail, but rather it's an energy, just like God is an energy. It's an energy of darkness that is in the universe. Swami Kriyananda said there were great rivers of consciousness flowing through the universe, and some were good and some were bad. But they're all in the container of God. So we have free choice to decide which river that we want to swim in. And today's reading was so beautiful, talking about the temptation of Christ. Again, you know, modern psychologists, but also Yogananda, saw this story as an allegorical story that, you know, Jesus had the power of God in him, but he also had the power of free choice. And when he was baptized and he went into the desert to meditate and fast and pray for 40 days and 40 nights, the temptation, instead of being a physical being that was tempting him, was his own unconscious desires, his own desire for the fact that with that power, he could have made the choice to become king of the world because he had that power. But instead, he fought off that ego desire, and he chose to be an instrument of God's light and love, which is what he was born into the world. But it just goes to show us that he was human. He was an embodiment of God in the human body, and because of that, he still had to fight those desires that can pull us out of our alignment with God. It's a very powerful, powerful story. And speaking of psychology, it made me think of Carl Jung, who's very famous for the concept of the collective unconscious. And Carl Jung said that every human being, regardless of religion or where we're born, how we're raised, we have an inherited set of experiences and archetypal energies and symbols that we're all familiar with. And Yogananda agreed with that assessment, except Carl Jung didn't take into account reincarnation. So what he was talking about, this collective unconscious, is actually our soul knowledge, and it's what we carry with us from lived experiences of many incarnations. And these archetypal energies, again, which are duality, there's the villain and the hero, for instance, or good and evil. The reason why those are embedded in our consciousness, our unconsciousness as symbols, is because we have lived already each of those roles. In some incarnations, we've been villainous, and then also heroic, and maybe even in the same incarnation. We've been the peacemaker and the trickster. You know, we've been many, many different things, and we carry that knowledge with us from incarnation to incarnation. So it's a very powerful thing. When I was on vacation recently, I saw children playing in a pond, and many of you may have seen this recently at beaches. There's these new foam mats that are really big, and they somehow get anchored to the bottom, and people can float on them. And the kids were on this really big oval royal blue foam mat. It was only about 3 feet away from the shore. And these were little kids, maybe 5 to 8 years old, and there were probably 9 of them. And after a few minutes, I realized the game they were playing was called Whale and Shark. And this big blue flotation device was the whale. And the game was, we have to stay on the whale. The whale is safe. They kept saying that. And then, of course, somebody would inevitably fall into the water and the shark would get them, you know? So that was, you know, interesting to me, because I thought these little tiny children already have that embedded in them, that benevolent whale, that safety, versus the shark, which is, you know, good versus evil. And it's interesting because in Christianity, we know the story of Jonah and the whale represents spiritual transformation. It was after Jonah was expelled from the whale's belly that he had a transformation. And Vishnu's first incarnation of his 10 was of a fish called Matsya. And in that story, the fish Matsya helps Manu overcome the great deluge, the flood that was taking over the earth, just like the story of Noah and the ark. And that fish, Matsya, if you look at pictures of Hindu mythology, it's a massive golden fish, and many people call it a whale. So it's just an example how psychologically we have these embedded knowledge, this embedded archetype of good and evil, that it's who we really are. The world right now, if we look around, the world is at war. So we can very easily see evil in the world. It's not hard for us to see that. We want to be careful that we don't attune ourselves to that evil, but it's very obvious that, there's war. There's wars in Africa, there's wars in the Middle East, and there's wars in the edge of Europe. And it's interesting to note that, but then also I think the lesson in that for us is to really look within to the war that we have within ourselves. Because that's what this satanic force is all about. It's that war within ourselves that each of us fight every day. It's the war against our temptation, our desire, our habits, our negative thought patterns. For some people, it's a war against addiction. But it's a very powerful energy that we could call satanic that is within us, and we're constantly working to overcome that. We have that image of the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. And Yogananda said that our conscientiousness is the voice of God, encouraging us to go to the light, to take the highest route in every situation. And then our temptation, our desire, is that satanic force that's trying to pull us down. And I think everyone here can relate to moments in our life where we had to make a choice. That's what free will is about. Anyone who's overcome addiction really understands that moment where you can choose to give in and go into the downward flowing energy of the astral spine, into the darkness, or you can choose God and you can fight that pull of darkness. And even with little habits, even if it's choosing not to eat the second piece of chocolate cake, we have a choice, and it's a powerful, everyone knows that there is a powerful energy that wants to pull us away from God. I'd like to just reread today's Bhagavad Gita reading, because it's so beautiful and succinct. And in this, Arjuna is asking Krishna, yet tell me, teacher, by what force doth man go to his ill? So what is the force that pulls us away from God, he's asking? Unwilling, as if one pushed him in that path. And again, I think everyone's had a situation in their life where they felt that there's something pulled them out, and it felt almost like out of their control. And Krishna replied, desire it is. Passion born of darkness. And that darkness is this satanic force that we're talking about, which pushes him, mighty of appetite, sinful and strong this is, man's enemy. So it's a really powerful passage, and an acknowledgement, again, that we have these competing forces within us. And the Bhagavad Gita itself, the whole story is about, it's an allegorical battle about that battle within ourselves, in our own astral spine. We can choose to let the energy run up to the spiritual eye and help us to transform desire, temptation, negative habits, addictions, or we can allow it to flow down and give into that darkness. Where was I going with that? Okay, in the battle, so Arjuna is standing and he looks across the battlefield, again, an allegorical battlefield, and he sees his teachers and his kinsmen and his friends. And he says to Krishna, how can I possibly fight my teachers and my kinsmen and my friends? And then Krishna goes on to talk about the righteousness of the battle. But the teachers are actually Arjuna's own temptations. They're his own negative habits, his own lower states of consciousness. And anyone who's overcome anything like that in their life understands, looking back, that that is our greatest teacher, isn't it? And whether that is moments of sadness and despair, or anger and fear, or an actual, some type of a addiction in the physical world that we have a hard time overcoming, or a bad habit, that is our greatest teacher when we finally do overcome it, when we use the power of God to rise up from that. It's a very, very powerful visual of that this battlefield is that battlefield within ourselves. I'd like to end with a dream that I had, and I've told this story before, but I really know that this came directly from Master, so I'd like to share it again. It was more than a decade ago. It might have been 12, even 15 years ago. It was when Kelly and I and Inez started giving Sunday services, and this was the topic I was assigned. It was the first time, like in the early days, giving a talk. And I was so terrified, first of all, of public speaking, but I studied this topic for like 3 days, and it was the night before Sunday service, and I had nothing. Because I was so in my brain, I was so in my mind, I couldn't even put a sentence together. And I literally went to bed crying. I meditated, and I just begged Master to send me something to talk about. And he sent me this superconscious dream. And in the dream, he was standing in his beautiful orange robes, and there was an image of a house like a child would draw, just like the front of a dollhouse with no facade. And the house was split in two, and on one side it was completely dark, and it was layers of sludge and muck and dirt. I can't even describe it, but just layers of darkness all the way up. And the other side was this incredible effulgence of divine light. And there was a window on the side with the light. And on the dark side, you couldn't see the window. It was obscured. And Master in the dream just stood in front and went like this. And he said, you get to choose which room you live in. Now, it's such a simple thought. You get to choose which room you live in. And that's what we're talking about today, is that everything we do is free choice. And the other imagery in the dream was that although there were two rooms in the house, a room of darkness and a room of light, both of them were in the house of God. And that's important for us to remember, that everything in the universe is of God. Even these currents of darkness and satanic pull and evil that we see, it's still in the realm of God. And that, again, because of our free choice, we get to choose whether we attune our consciousness to these beautiful rivers of divine light and love and wisdom and bliss and peace and harmony, or if we get pulled down and we attune our consciousness to these dark rivers of consciousness. And that's the battle, basically. That's the entire battle. So just remember to live in God's light. And the beauty of these practices is that they help us every day, twice a day, by meditating, to stay in the river of God's light. They keep us in the river of God's light. And that during the day when we have to make choices, when we're tempted by something, some desire, we have the ability, because of that attunement to God, to say no to the lower desire and to ask God to purify that and bring us back into God's light.